You know what's a pretty universal childhood dream? Flying. Like actual flying. Not the cramped airplane seat kind, where you're wedged between a crying baby and someone who brought tuna fish onto a 3-hour flight. I'm talking about the superhero kind. Wings, soaring through clouds, the whole deal. And honestly, that's a pretty reasonable thing to fantasize about considering how cool flight is. But here's something that might blow your mind a little bit. Dinosaurs, those ancient terrible lizards that dominated the planet for over 160 million years, almost figured out how to fly. And I don't mean in the way that birds are technically dinosaurs, which, yes, we'll get to that. I mean actual full-sized, ground-dwelling dinosaurs came incredibly close to taking to the skies multiple times throughout their evolutionary history. And some of them, they actually did. Sort of. So today we're going to explore the absolutely wild journey of how dinosaurs flirted with flight, the bizarre creatures that emerged from these experiments, and the few that actually managed to pull it off. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to have a very different image of what flying dinosaurs looked like. Spoiler alert, it's way weirder than Jurassic Park led you to believe. Now, before we dive into the main event, we need to address the elephant in the room, or the pterosaur in the sky, I guess. When most people think of flying dinosaurs, their minds immediately jump to pterodactyls. You know, those leathery winged reptiles that always seem to be swooping down and causing problems in dinosaur movies. And yeah, those things were absolutely real and absolutely terrifying. But here's the thing that's going to sound like a total technicality, but is actually pretty important. Pterosaurs weren't dinosaurs. I know, it's like finding out Pluto isn't a planet all over again. But pterosaurs were actually a separate group of reptiles that evolved flight completely independently from dinosaurs. They were cousins, not siblings. Close relatives who showed up to the same family reunion, but definitely not the same thing. But with that said, pterosaurs are still worth mentioning because they show us what was possible in terms of reptilian flight. These things ranged from sparrow-sized creatures to animals with wingspans larger than a fighter jet. The biggest of these, Quetzalcoatlus, had a wingspan of up to 40 feet. That's wider than most houses. And this giraffe-sized flying nightmare could launch itself into the air and soar for hundreds of miles. So yeah, flight was definitely on the table during the Mesozoic era. The question is, did any actual dinosaurs manage to pull it off? And the answer is yes, but probably not in the way you're imagining. Let's start with the group that eventually became the undisputed masters of the sky, birds. Now, if you've spent any time reading about dinosaur evolution, you've probably heard the phrase birds are dinosaurs about 1,000 times. And it's true, birds aren't just descended from dinosaurs. They literally are dinosaurs. Specifically, they're a branch of theropods, the same group that includes famous names like Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor, which means that technically speaking, every time you see a pigeon, you're looking at a living dinosaur. Kind of takes the magic out of it, doesn't it? But here's where things get interesting. The transition from ground-dwelling theropods to fully airborne birds didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that took tens of millions of years and involved some of the strangest creatures you've ever seen. And the story begins roughly 160 million years ago with a little feathered dinosaur called Archaeopteryx. This is the poster child for transitional fossils, and for good reason. Archaeopteryx had the teeth and tail of a dinosaur, but also had feathers and wings like a bird. It's basically evolution's rough draft of what a flying dinosaur should look like. Now, for the longest time, scientists debated whether Archaeopteryx could actually fly, or if it just glided from tree to tree like a scaly flying squirrel. And the answer seems to be somewhere in between. It probably could fly, but not very well. More like awkward flapping with a lot of crash landings. Think of it as the Wright brothers' first airplane, but with more scales and significantly worse life insurance rates. But the point is, it worked, kind of. And that opened the door for other dinosaurs to experiment with flight. Over the next several million years, we start seeing all sorts of feathered dinosaurs popping up in the fossil record. Microraptor, for example, had 4 wings. Yes, 4. 2 on its arms and 2 on its legs, creating this bizarre biplane configuration that honestly looks like something out of a fever dream. And based on fossil evidence and computer modeling, Microraptor could actually glide pretty effectively, leaping from tree to tree and probably terrifying anything smaller than itself. Which, given that it was only about the size of a crow, wasn't a whole lot, but still, 4 wings. Evolution really just threw everything at the wall to see what stuck. Then there's Yi Chi, which might have the shortest dinosaur name ever, and also might be one of the weirdest. This thing had membranous wings, kind of like a bat, supported by a bizarre rod-like bone that extended from its wrist. It's like evolution looked at feathered flight and said, nah, let's try the leather look instead. And for a while, scientists thought this was just a weird one-off. But then they found another species, Ambopteryx, with the same bat-like wing structure. So apparently at least some dinosaurs were experimenting with mammalian-style flight. And based on what we know, it kind of worked? Maybe? The fossils suggest these dinosaurs could glide, but probably not very efficiently. It was basically evolution's failed side project that got abandoned pretty quickly. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, and also way more tragic, because while these small theropods were figuring out how to take to the skies, there were other dinosaurs that also developed feathers and wing-like structures, but remained firmly grounded. And I'm talking about some pretty substantial animals here. Oviraptorosaurs, for example, were turkey to ostrich-sized dinosaurs that had feathers, wing-like arms, and even brooded their nests like modern birds. But they couldn't fly. They were just too big. It's like they had all the equipment but none of the weight restrictions. And then there's perhaps the most frustrating example of all, the dromaeosaurs. You probably know them better as raptors, velociraptors, Deinonychus utahraptor. All these guys had feathers, full-on bird-like plumage, and their arms structured almost identically to bird wings. But they were too heavy to fly. They were ground-bound hunters who just happened to look like they should be able to take off at any moment. It's like showing up to a costume party in a Superman outfit, but being unable to leave the ground. Nature's cruel joke. But wait, there's more. Because recently, paleontologists discovered something that really throws a wrench into the whole dinosaur flight narrative. And that discovery is a dinosaur called Fujian venator. This thing lived about 150 million years ago and had ridiculously long legs, like disproportionately long, suggesting it was either a fast runner or, and here's where it gets wild, potentially adapted for wading through water like modern shorebirds. But here's the kicker. It's closely related to the ancestors of modern birds, which means that even as some dinosaurs were evolving flight, others in the same family were going in completely different directions. Some were learning to fly, others were becoming better runners, and some were apparently just vibing in swamps. Evolution doesn't follow a straight path, it turns out. Now here's where we need to talk about the other almost flyers, because it wasn't just small theropods that were experimenting with getting airborne. There's evidence that some ornithischians, the bird-hip dinosaurs, which is a confusing name because they're not actually related to birds, also developed feather-like structures. Kulendrodromeus, a small plant-eating dinosaur from Russia, had what appear to be primitive feathers. And while there's no evidence it could fly or even glide, it does show that feathers weren't exclusive to the theropod lineage. They might have been way more common among dinosaurs than we thought, which opens up the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there were other groups of dinosaurs that came close to flight but haven't been discovered yet. And then there's the sauropods. You know, the long-necked giants like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus? Now obviously these things weren't flying, they were the size of buildings. But there is a bizarre theory that some of the smaller sauropods might have been able to rear up on their hind legs and use their tails as a sort of counterbalance, almost like a spring, to launch themselves forward in massive leaps. Is that flight? No. Is it close? Also no. But it's a fun mental image, so I'm including it. You're welcome. But let's bring it back to the main story. Because while most dinosaurs failed to achieve sustained flight, one group succeeded spectacularly, and those were the aviolans, the direct ancestors of modern birds. By the late Cretaceous, about 70 to 80 million years ago, we start seeing birds that look remarkably similar to what we have today. Hyperiornis, for example, was a diving bird that looked like a prehistoric loon. Hyperiornis was a tern-like seabird that hunted fish. These weren't clumsy proto-birds. These were fully functional flying animals that had mastered the skies. And here's the truly remarkable part. When that asteroid hit 66 million years ago and wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, birds survived. They made it through the mass extinction event that killed off T-Rex, Triceratops, and every other large dinosaur. And they didn't just survive, they thrived. Today, there are over 10,000 species of birds. They've colonized every continent, including Antarctica. They range in size from tiny hummingbirds to massive ostriches, and every single one of them is a living, breathing dinosaur that succeeded where so many others failed. So in a way, dinosaurs didn't almost take to the skies. They did take to the skies. It just took them about 100 million years of trial and error to figure it out. From Archaeopteryx's awkward flapping to Microraptor's four-wing gliding to Yi-Chi's bat-wing experiments, the path to flight was messy, weird, and full of evolutionary dead ends. But eventually, one branch of the dinosaur family tree figured it out, and now they're everywhere. Annoying you at the park, stealing your french fries, pooping on your car, the dinosaurs won. They're just a lot smaller and less impressive than we imagined. But imagine if things had gone differently. Imagine if some of the larger theropods had managed to evolve flight. Picture a velociraptor-sized animal with fully functional wings, hunting in packs from the air. or a feathered Deinonychus that could swoop down from trees like a prehistoric eagle. The Mesozoic skies would have been even more terrifying than they already were. And honestly, I'm kind of glad it didn't work out that way. Parasaurs were bad enough. We didn't need flying raptors on top of that. So, the next time you see a bird, maybe give it a little respect. That pigeon you're annoyed at, its ancestors survived a mass extinction, outlasted T-Rex, and figured out one of the most complex forms of locomotion in the animal kingdom. And sure, it's now eating garbage and bothering tourists, but hey, it's still a dinosaur. And that's kind of cool when you think about it. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Primeval Zoo.